I was browsing through the internet one day. A story from the Mail Online caught my eye and I read it. The story involved a dad from California, his 11-year-old daughter, and a professional photographer. When I finished reading, I said, "This photographer wins my Mother Teresa of the Year award for 2014, and I want to tell you why." Jim Zetz, that's the dad of the 11-year-old, had stage 4 pancreatic cancer. He wasn't long for this world. He'd never see his little girl grow up to achieve most of the milestones in life about which loving fathers normally dream. No high school, no college, no career, marriage, children. He wouldn't even see her graduate from junior high. Photographer Lindsay Villatoro, that's the Mother Teresa of this story, knew all about this. She'd been hired by the family to take some final portrait shots. Lindsay got an idea while she was doing this. What if they accomplished at least one of Dad's milestones before he died? Like marching his daughter down the aisle? Like a fake partial wedding? What if they got cake and a pastor and invited friends and family and bought gifts and did it in 3 days? Jim could walk his daughter down the aisle after all, and Lindsay could capture it all on film. The photographer sprang into action. It took her 3 days, which is good because they didn't have much time. She raised the money, got the cake, notified the neighbors, secured the pastor, bought the flowers, then had the whole thing catered in Jim's backyard. She got out her camera and recorded the whole thing. Well, they had their wedding. Emaciated, nearly hairless Dad looked elegant in tux and hat, walked his fragile, elf-like little girl down the aisle. The officiating pastor pronounced them daddy and daughter. The pictures Mother Teresa got from this wedding will make you cry. The whole of human experience lies bare in this activity. The beginnings for the little girl, the endings for the dad, the tears of the people who love them both. It is the most poignant portrait of grief you'll ever see. The reason I'm bringing this up is that grief is the subject of this lecture. It's logical. We are at the end of our developmental unit. We started with life, and now we're going to end with death. I'm going to use this story to specifically focus on the brain's reactions to grief. We'll start where we always do, looking for evolutionary reasons why such powerful feelings exist. Then we'll talk about how people transit through the grief process, and we'll end with some practical advice. Mostly it's a website I'd recommend that you actually visit. Let's get started. People grieve all over the world. They generally reserve their deepest mourning mostly for the same thing, the death of a loved one. Is there any Darwinian reason for this universality? Is there any selective pressure that favors going into mourning? Is there a reason why we grieve so mightily over certain losses that sometimes we're suicidal? That's Darwinian forfeiture. You might be surprised at my answer. Most of us don't think there is any selective pressure on the grief reaction. Most of us think grief is an incidental response to something else. Grief and evolution are related, but only in the same way that grilling a hamburger and a dirty barbecue are related. The dirt comes from the cooking. It was never the reason you fired up the grill. I think this can be illustrated simply. If you've ever been in a mall and temporarily lost your 5-year-old, you know what panic feels like. Your stress hormones rise, your heart pounds, you sweat, you imagine and fear often the worst. Those icky feelings do not subside until you find your child. And then a really weird thing happens. When you reunite, your mood swings in the exact opposite direction. Now you're relieved. Panic is suddenly replaced with gratitude, with celebration, pleasure, a dopamine lollipop, a true reward, and maybe a trip to the timeout room to teach Junior to stay by your side when shopping. The lost child often goes through the same two-cycled set of feelings. Panic and tension when he can't find his parents, loving and bonding when he does. Those reactions present in both parent and child are biological in nature. I know you're sick of hearing this, but we have just stumbled on another social argument. If we survived because we stuck together, we cooperated, a direct product of that was to put a premium on close relationships. We're panicked when they are lost. We are rewarded when we have them. Sad when we lose them. Reward, punishment, pleasure, depression. It gives us panic when important relationships become compromised, and there is no greater compromising than permanent loss. Some of us think grief comes from that last sentence. It's powerful. It's also accidental. It mostly underscores the importance the brain assigns to relationships, grief being the incidental dirty barbecue of life. Hannah Waters, writing for Scientific American, puts it succinctly, quote, "Grief is the price we pay for friendship," close quote. I couldn't agree more. Now I need to say this. Just because it may be a byproduct does not mean it isn't awful. As anybody who has ever gone through grief can tell you, and my guess is that's most of you, it is amongst the most difficult things you will ever experience. Now, as a biologist, you can ask another question. If it is an unwelcome byproduct of being social, do other social animals experience grief when they lose people they know? Some people say yes. There are numerous accounts of elephants reacting to the deaths of other elephants. I have to confess, I am usually pretty skeptical about interpreting animal behavior in human terms. Our willingness to anthropomorphize is so palpable, we even do it with cars. In the case of elephants, we can't get a microphone inside their heads and find out what is going on emotionally. Yet the elephant behavior is difficult to dismiss. Elephants will often visit the site of the death of clan members years after the death, finding the bones, turning them over and over with their trunks. I leave it to you to interpret what that means, because we're going to be heading into something else. We are going to leave our discussion about evolutionary roots and get into grief reactions. That means we're in part 2, whose subject is stages of grief, but begins with some myth-busting. I am about to seriously ding the work of Elisabeth Kubler-Ross, or at least ding how she is often interpreted. Before I do, let me first say a few words on her behalf. I admire her legacy, though perhaps not her data. For those of you not familiar with Elisabeth Kubler-Ross, she wrote a book years ago called On Death and Dying. She examined what people go through when they find they have a terminal disorder. She said they went through stages of grief. The names of these stages have become so much a part of the public conversation that it's difficult to remember a time when they weren't around. There was the initial denial stage. It's when a person first hears about their disorder and pretty much refuses to believe it. There's an anger stage. That's where it begins to sink in that the person is terminal and it really ticks them off. There's a bargaining stage. This is where people try to negotiate their way out of the bad news. The bargaining can be directed at God, usually in an attempt to stave off the inevitable. If you let me live, I will give $100 million to charity. Please let me hang around long enough to walk my daughter down the aisle. Then there's a depression stage. This is where the person understands there's nothing they can do, not charity work, not milestones for their kids. Nothing will stop the bad stuff from coming. And finally, there's the acceptance stage. It's mostly an emotional white flag. It's often accompanied by a feeling of peace, however bittersweet it may be. Elisabeth Kubler-Ross, more than anyone else, has put our grief responses to death and dying into the public discourse. That includes the research world, and because of that, we owe her a great debt. These are some of the words I wanted to say on her behalf. I want to say something else positive, too. This centers around a Disney movie. I am old enough to have seen the movie Bambi in its original theatrical release. What I remember mostly is the death scene. I saw it as a little boy, cried my eyes out. Years later, I recall having some of the same feelings Kubler-Ross described, which was comforting, so I owe her. For those of you who have not seen this, the death scene opens with Bambi and Mom eating grass in the midst of winter snow. Mom suddenly senses something. The ominous music now swells to the floor and she cries, "Bambi, quick, the thicket!" She panics. They run. Suddenly the sound of gunshots ring out. "Faster, Bambi," she yells. "Don't look back. Keep running. Keep running." One more set of gunshots and it's all over. You see Bambi running into the thicket. He's wandering around, pathetically calling her name. No mom. Instead, there is angelic, low choir music. Never a good sign in a Disney movie. It starts to snow when suddenly Bambi bumps into a magnificent stag. The music stops. "Your mother can't be with you anymore," he intones gravely. Bambi starts to cry. He continues, "Come, my son." I was sad and scared and depressed and angry and not believing what I saw on the screen at first. Even as a little kid. Everything, in short, Elisabeth Kubler-Ross said I would. Okay, so thanks. Now to the dinging. Kubler-Ross published her book way back in 1969. That was a time when our understanding of how the brain works was much more primitive than now. Researchers began to test parts of her ideas and assertions, and she unfortunately came up short. Sorry. First up, not everybody experienced all 5 stages when they grieved. Nor did everyone go through the stages in the described order when the stages were present. Some people flitted between one stage and another, moving back and forth between them kind of like a pinball. Rather than the existence of a common lockstep, it was looking more like bereavement was very individually experienced. No one size fits all. To make a very long story short, Elisabeth's work was groundbreaking by awareness, but not groundbreaking by data or by application. It was clear new models of grief responses were needed, perhaps one not so tied up with 5 death and dying stages. Just such new models were right around the corner. So let's get into it a bit. Part 3, a new model. What happens when you look outside the world of people who are dying of a terminal illness? What happens when you take the least complex case, the reactions when someone else dies? George Bonanno from Columbia is one researcher who looked at such things. He performed what's called a prospective study. That's a type of research where you follow a group of people over time to see what happens to them. The people here was a group of elderly married couples, 1,500 strong, and the what happens to them was how they grieved when their spouse died. The group was tracked for several years. About 200 subjects lost their spouse during the course of the study. You might have expected that nearly 100% of the survivors, people who'd lost their best friend, right, of many decades, you'd expect people like these would suffer devastating depressions, ones from which they would never fully recover. That was certainly one of the prevailing attitudes of the time. Anybody who loses someone close invariably gets distressed, overwhelmingly so. It's not too far off from what many people believe now. They might have been like Jimmy Stewart. You probably recall Jimmy Stewart. He's the guy who played George Bailey in the movie It's a Wonderful Life. He had one of the rarest experiences in all of Hollywood, staying married to his best friend all his life. The lucky woman was a model named Gloria McLean. They were close as 2 people could be, and when she died of lung cancer at the age of 75, Jimmy went into a tailspin. Here's one account of his reaction. Jimmy never got over Gloria's death. He spent the next couple of years puttering around the garden that he and his wife were so proud of. After Gloria died, Jimmy would sit there for hours talking to his wife. He missed her terribly, and it began taking a toll on his own health. His last words before he died in 1997, 3 years after her death, were, quote, "I'm going to be with Gloria now," close quote. We'll have more to say about this type of grief later. It's called complicated grief. But back to George Bonanno, the guy who was doing the prospective study on 1,500 Jimmy Stewarts. What did Dr. George Bonanno find? What he found was truly groundbreaking, and here's the reason. Jimmy Stewart's reaction was not typical. Even in relationships as solid as his, as warm as his, as long as his, devastation over time is exactly what George did not see. Less than a third of the survivors actually suffered from distressing depressions. And even amongst that limited population, more than 10% were free of depression 18 months later. Half of the survivors showed no signs of depression at all. 1 in 10 actually felt relieved that the death had occurred. The couples were tracked for 18 months after the funeral, just to see if these resilient reactions were maintained. And they were. Many felt a short-term sadness, for sure, but over time the results were clear. 70% of the cohort never suffered serious side effects at all. This was very different from the prevailing notion. The normal reaction to death was not devastation, it seemed, but recovery. There were no stages of grief to go through for the vast majority of people. The normal reaction to death was, funny to use this term, but it's George's term, resilience. I have to tell you a personal story about a relative of mine. He illustrates this idea of resilience nicely, and I'm going to call him Bill. He typifies much of Bonanno's prospective research. I've known Bill for many years. He had a tight, multi-decade relationship with his wife, beautiful kids, successful career, like Jimmy Stewart's. Bill's wife eventually died of cancer. His reaction was sadness and loss, typical, as were the children's reactions. But it didn't stay that way for Bill. Soon after his beloved's death, Bill found another person with whom he wanted to share the rest of his life. Less than a year after the funeral, he married this new woman, and he is still married to her. The kids were flabbergasted at the time. They told him so with versions of, "Oh, Dad, couldn't you have waited a while?" Bill had had a wonderful relationship with his first wife. It was so fulfilling, he obviously wanted another one. I can just see George Bonanno smiling. Not everybody sails through grief, of course. It's just that George has confirmed there's no one-size-fits-all way to go through bereavement, and that for most people, resilience appears to be the norm. Does that mean every human bereavement is so individually understood it is impossible to measure? Is it all totally random? George drilled down on this question further. He decided to investigate the magic resilient majority who truly felt loss, but recovered from it in a relatively short period of time. He found some very interesting things. He found there were reactive behaviors you could categorize. They were compensatory. Some people actively repressed their distressing thoughts. Some people laughed about the experience of death, trying to use humor to soften the negative feelings. Others retreated into a form of pronounced egocentrism, a category he calls self-enhancing bias. Many reactions fell outside the normal range of typical reactions to loss, but they all ended up in resilience. Some in the mental health counseling community might consider these compensatory behaviors self-defeating. And some of it does sound like denial, the ghost of Elisabeth Kubler-Ross casting a familiar shadow. What they all have in common is a strong desire to right the ship after a period of time, which is why I call them compensatory behaviors. George simply calls it coping ugly. You should know George's work has not met with universal acclaim. There are many types of trauma, many reactions to differing types of trauma, and resilience does not characterize all types of reactions to loss, even within one category. There have been criticisms that he uses the concept of resilience too simplistically. All that is just so much research-backed chatter. I bring up Bonanno's work for the same reason I brought up Kubler-Ross. His greatest contribution may simply be to start the conversation about alternative explanations for grief now that the 5 stages have been successfully challenged. People really do grieve when they lose people they love, even if one size doesn't fit all. One example of this type of shaking up is the characterization of something researchers call complicated grief. It's the minority experience, and it is the opposite of resilience. To introduce this, we turn to no less a luminary than England's long-reigning monarch, Queen Victoria of England, who ruled from 1837 to 1901. Her story is the female version of the Jimmy Stewart story. In 1861, the beloved husband of Queen Victoria, Prince Albert, died. They'd been married 21 years, a rich relationship by all accounts. They had 9 children. Her Majesty never got over Albert's demise. Her Majesty didn't even leave the palace for almost 3 years after the death occurred. This earned her the title of the Widow of Windsor. She never remarried either. Queen Victoria wore black for the rest of her days. And there were a lot of days, because she would reign another 40 years. She once wrote to the then 82-year-old Lord Gough, who had just lost his wife, also after many years of marriage, quote, "The Queen has heard with much concern of the sad affliction that has befallen Lord Gough, and is anxious to express personally her sincere sympathy to him. Irreparable as his loss is, how blessed to have lived together until the evening of their lives, with the comfort and hope of the separation being a short one. To the poor Queen, this blessing so needful to her has been denied, and she can only hope never to live to old age, but be allowed to rejoin her beloved great and loyal husband before many years elapse." Close quote. That's not typical grief, folks. We've talked about the fact that it's normal to go through extreme periods of discomfort, sadness, and overwhelming loss when someone close dies. You feel shock. You feel disorientation, just like Queen Victoria probably did in the first months after Albert's death. What is not normal is to have these intense feelings last for years, decades even. Researchers started calling the grief response that people like the Queen may have experienced persistent grief or complicated grief. And scientists wanted to know what separated people caught in this form of bereavement from the more typically resilient responses. They found some interesting things. For example, if you give an antidepressant to people experiencing complicated grief, certain negative symptoms are relieved. The symptoms that go away are the classic behaviors usually associated with depression, like the extreme sadness people with complicated grief feel. Some researchers believe that the death of a loved one can trigger a depression, just like other traumatic events can trigger a depression. What does not go away is the persistent, automatically thinking about the loved one. That phenomenon, often called intrusive thoughts, stays put. Another feeling that does not go away with complicated grief is the intense, desperate aching for the loved one to come back. These people did not adjust in any meaningful way to life without their loved one. Even years later, people with complicated grief were still like Queen Victoria. It's estimated that between 10 and 15% of all mourners fall into this category. It occurred to researchers that there were maybe 2 circuits operating in the brain during bereavement. One mediates depression, that's the feeling the medications could control, and one mediates bereavement, that's the feeling for which antidepressants can do nothing. One of the world's great authorities on this type of grief is researcher Holly Prigerson. She has spent decades looking at this type of grieving. Her work has inspired researchers to go after the quote-unquote bereavement circuit, and a researcher at UCLA may have found one. People who experience complicated grief display a very specific activation of a region in the brain we've mentioned before, way back in lecture number 12. It's called the nucleus accumbens. That is a very interesting finding, mostly because of its function. As you might recall, the nucleus accumbens is the region usually associated with pleasure and rewards. It is also associated with addictive behavior, and fear. How do you know if you are suffering from normal bereavement or complicated grief? The answer to that lies in our practical application section. We begin with something of a lighter note, if that's possible with a subject like this, then we'll talk about the criteria. I love the way some famous people have approached their deaths. Probably made it easier on the living. You can get a hint of their attitudes and priorities by looking at their epitaphs. 4 speak loudly to me. I had a lover's quarrel with the world. Robert Frost. Against you I will fling myself unvanquished and unyielding, O death. That's Virginia Woolf. I am ready to meet my maker Whether my maker is prepared for the great ordeal of meeting me is another matter. Winston Churchill. But my favorite of all time is George Bernard Shaw's. I knew if I stayed around long enough, something like this would happen. The reason why I love to read about these is social. Death is almost never an easy subject to talk about with other people. These provide some emotional griefs for me and for others, it would seem. I have grieved, but I have not experienced complicated grief. For some people, there's no emotional griefs. They have and do experience complicated grief. We're going to discuss how you know if you or a loved one you know suffers from complicated grief. We'll discover soon enough that the answer isn't easy. It stirred up some controversy, which by now you know is not all that unusual in this field. Various work groups have suggested two characteristics that must be present to distinguish complicated grief from standard or typical grief responses. Number one, the grieving person has to pine for their loss with such extreme intensity that normal functioning is regularly disrupted. It's a daily disruption. Here's how one psychiatrist put it, quote, "This response may be accompanied by difficulty accepting the death, anger over the loss, a diminished sense of identity, feeling that life is empty, and problems in engaging in new relationships or activities." Priggerson might add continuously avoiding anything that reminds you of the death and an inability to trust others. Number two, the severe feelings have to last for at least 6 months. Here's the practical application. If someone close to you has died, and what I just said fits a description of how you are reacting, do 3 things. First, I would direct you to a website, the Anxiety and Depression Association of America. Find the interview entitled Recognizing and Treating Complicated Grief. There you will meet Catherine Shear, professor of psychiatry at Columbia, who maintains some terrific materials on the subject. Second, if those criteria, both the ones I mentioned here and Dr. Shear's insights, resonate with you, I suggest you go see your mental health professional. Tell him or her you're wondering about complicated grief. The third recommendation is relevant if you know someone who's currently grieving or going through other kinds of trauma, such as recovery from an accident. Many people are at a loss about what to feel, about what to say, about what to do when a loved one goes through such troubling times, and it may be the easiest to address. In fact, we've already addressed it. I'm not sure if you remember from way back in lecture number 5, but I told you the story of psychologist Leo Buscaglia, who had been asked to judge a contest seeking to find the most caring child. Do you remember this? The winner was this little 4-year-old boy who found a way to comfort an elderly neighbor grieving in his backyard on the loss of his wife of many years. The little guy's mother observed the whole thing amazed. Here's a partial quote. Quote, "When his mother asked him what he had said to the neighbor, the little boy said, 'Nothing. I just helped him cry.'" The little guy didn't try to fix the problem. He didn't try to offer wise words. He didn't bring out his mother's copy of Death and Dying and try to read a few chapters. Tears are what he brought. Empathy is what he brought. Empathy is probably the best thing you can offer to someone who has faced such loss. One of the best full-throated responses you can give grieving people is to sit right next to them and start crying, just like a 4-year-old. I will warn you before we leave this topic that not everyone agrees with the complicated grief story, especially as it relates to depression. Some people think we're in danger of medicalizing grief, that feeling rotten for long periods of time is just as typical as getting over it with resilience and aplomb. Once again, this notion of one size not fitting all comes to mind. And that's the whole reason to bring this up. Research into grief has come a long way since the Kubler-Ross era did us the favor of waking us up. It also has a long ways to go, as I suspect both Bonanno and Priggerson would maintain. No one quibbles with the fact that grief is an evolutionary byproduct of our deep need to be with each other. No better example of that exists than finding out how deeply we react when we can't. That 11-year-old girl is a good example of this. She will recall the day of her dying daddy walking her down the aisle the rest of her life. She may remember it as the worst day and the best day she has ever experienced. I wish you well.